Well, welcome back to another Q&A. We are here to discuss yesterday's sermon on Psalm 24. And before we get in a few questions, Murray, why don't you recap the sermon?
Psalm 24, at least the first 6 verses, are about the Lord being king over all the universe. And as the Lord being king over all the universe, not only does he rule and reign because he is the creator, but he rules and reigns with great generosity as he invites those who are unable to worship because of their sin into worship through his generosity.
We're easy to ascribe characteristics of God like, he is loving, he is kind, he's patient. Mm-hmm. But sometimes we forget just how generous God really is. How does us seeing God as a generous God help us worship him more, love him more, serve him more?
Well, if you think about it just in terms of the way that we experience generosity on an earthly level, if I were to invite your family over for dinner and it was this big, extravagant kind of a meal, and we spent time, before we had a long leisurely dinner, and we spent time doing things afterwards, you would want to in turn be generous to me, not to pay me back, but just because it was a natural response to that kind of generosity. Well, if we take that kind of generosity that I described in terms of a meal and multiply it times the universe, we see just a beginning glimpse of God's generosity to us that calls us, or just sort of draws us to be generous, not only towards him, but also towards others, not to pay him or others back, but just in simply a response to his generosity.
Yeah, that's a great point of when we experience God's generosity, it's such a perfect model for the definition of generosity and how we can be generous to others.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love the point you made in verse 3 when it was asking, who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? And the answer is no one except Jesus. And that's a humbling statement to realize, like, we don't have the capacity to do it on our own. How does being humble in the Lord maybe help us see more of his generosity and help us be generous?
Well, when we begin to think about the cost to Christ to enable us to participate in worship, because that's what the psalm does. It says, who is able to ascend the hill of the Lord? And it lists all these attributes describing a moral righteousness. And the answer to the question is, well, nobody except for Christ. And then we contemplate Christ used his righteousness in the ultimate form of generosity. What that does is it does two things. It exposes our sinfulness, which means nobody can earn it, which means the more and more we reflect on our sinfulness, the more and more we reflect on our need for God's grace, which is the second thing it does. It points us to Jesus. The more and more we reflect on that, the more and more we realize we bring nothing to the table to the Lord, which means it results in humility, which means if God has been so generous to us, then how could we do anything but respond in likewise fashion?
Yeah, generosity.
In generosity.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you listening this morning. If you have any questions about the sermon or future sermons, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, thank you for your support of Cobble Park.